government will never surrender to the IRA. Never.
These people will never win. Democracy will triumph over evil.
In the shadows, the British state, the Brits, prepared to take the war to the IRA. The ground was laid by 14 Intelligence Company, the Det, the Army's most secret surveillance unit. The new offensive gave rise to allegations that the Brits had a policy of shoot to kill, fueled by a series of bloody confrontations. In one incident, the Det were monitoring IRA weapons in a field. When it was known the IRA was coming, the Det and the SAS made ready.
Myself and my partner drove out 2 members of the SAS and we dropped them off near to where the weapons were hidden. It wasn't a gung-ho attitude. The SAS were there primarily to arrest them and recover the weapons.
Such operations were meticulously planned. Only when the intelligence was confirmed would the go-ahead be given. Lives were on the line.
What did you hear?
What we heard over our radio net, there was the words contact, contact, which obviously meant an engagement was occurring. There was also the sound of gunfire.
And what happened to the 2 IRA men?
They were killed. Weapons were recovered from them.
Was a warning given?
I was told a warning was shouted to them, yes.
Who told you?
That was from the SAS.
Did you believe them?
I did.
Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness presided at the funeral of the 2 dead IRA men, known to be Brian Campbell and Colm McGurr. They were buried with full IRA honours. The IRA alleged the SAS had given no warning, no chance to surrender. Republicans accused the SAS of murder, their central charge against the British state. I was here in South Armagh at the beginning of 1976, reporting a series of horrendous tit-for-tat sectarian killings. And I vividly remember wondering whether indeed the province was on the brink of civil war. You could see the fear in people's faces, and you could almost taste it in the air. Since the early 70s, I'd watched successive governments try to end the bloodshed with a variety of political solutions, and by even talking directly to the IRA. But all these attempts had failed. By 1976, it was clear that politics had reached a dead end, and that the IRA was determined to carry on killing. It wasn't therefore surprising that the government made security its #1 priority, and the SAS was the cutting edge.
The SAS ought to give it its proper title, the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. One of the smallest and certainly the most secret fighting force in the world. They're taught to kill, maim, damage and destroy here in the somewhat mundane surroundings of Herefordshire.
The SAS was no stranger to Northern Ireland, as over the years members had served there giving advice to other regiments. But now the SAS was to be deployed officially to take on the IRA in South Armagh.
Certainly when they were first deployed, there was the IRA fear that there was an SAS trooper hiding under every bush. And so as a result of that, the IRA became very much more circumspect.
I think there was a fear that this rather mysterious body called the SAS, which most people didn't in fact know very much about, if it were deployed in Northern Ireland, it might act in some rather ruthless way and perhaps lead to criticism. On the other hand, there was the argument that the SAS was a very professional body of men. If deployed, it could probably do some military tasks better than anybody else. Therefore, why not deploy it?
But before that arm was triggered, other agencies had to provide the vital intelligence. RUC Special Branch recruited informers. MI5 planted listening devices in IRA houses and hides, and undercover soldiers, the Det, bugged IRA weapons and tracked their men on the ground.
I wanted to be in there. I wanted to be at the forefront. I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to make a contribution, I suppose. At least do a professional job, work with professional people, not just wander around aimlessly, wandering around the countryside, you know, talking to the locals, presenting yourself as a target occasionally.
Frank did several tours with the Det in the 70s and 80s. We haven't identified undercover soldiers for reasons of personal security.
This unit obviously was a very professional unit and had some impact on the situation. There was a quote by some senior officer who comes to mind that one operator, which is what we were called, was worth a company of soldiers on the ground.
Which is how many?
120, something like that.
Every day, the men and women of the Det risked their lives operating undercover in the heart of Republican strongholds. In Derry, the IRA tried to hijack an operator's car, not knowing who he was or that his partner was close behind.
I was the lead car of two, and as we drove around the back of the Rossville flats, I was hijacked.
Jim joined the Det in the late 70s and became one of its most experienced operators. He's lucky to be alive. What happened?
They had a system then of hijacking cars to use in bombings, and they assumed I was a prime target for hijack, a relatively young single bloke in a car on my own. Two gunmen emerged from the corner of a street and flagged me down, stopped me, drew their guns and tried to get me out of the car. And unfortunately, the gunman that day took on the wrong people.
Jim's partner in the following car saw what was happening. What does your colleague do behind you?
He got out of his car and fired two shots at each of the two gunmen. He missed one, hit the other in the leg, and the one on the left-hand side ran away who hadn't been hit, and the one that hit in the leg went down on the pavement. The guy who'd been hit in the leg was still a threat to me. He still had the gun in his hand, and so I shot him 4 times through the chest.
But why do you kill him if he's already on the ground and wounded?
He had a gun in his hand. He was still a threat.
Kick the gun away from him? Take the gun away from him?
It wasn't as simple as that.
Shoot him in the arm? Why kill him?
It wasn't as simple as that. No, it was a case of he had to go down.
In such a savage conflict, no love was lost between soldiers and the IRA. But sometimes innocent civilians were victims too. In this graveyard in the village of Dunloy, an SAS operation ended in tragedy. A 16-year-old Catholic schoolboy, John Boyle, was looking at an old family grave when he stumbled upon an IRA arms cache. He immediately ran home and told his father.
He said he had been in the graveyard and he had discovered under the fallen tombstone what to him looked like bomb material, a conglomeration of stuff packed onto the headstone.
John's father then rang the police. For a Catholic in a fiercely Republican area, to do so in support of law and order took considerable courage.
I didn't want to see any policeman shot, and I did fear that rather than for any other purpose that it would be used against police. I knew the police and knew them well enough and didn't want that to happen. And that prompted me to send them the word.
The police said they would be in touch, but no word came that evening. The following morning, Con Boyle heard shots and rushed to the graveyard. The SAS had shot his son dead.
I came down here, and as soon as I got out of the car, the two men came out from behind these pillars with rifles and arrested me.
Two soldiers?
Two soldiers, yes. And at that time we didn't see John, and they made reference to John in lying in there.
What did they say?
They said that the other bastard was lying in there dead.
That's what they said?
As they said, yes.
John had returned to the graveyard, probably just to check if his find was still there. Where were the soldiers?
This is where they were supposed to be.
What, just here?
Just there, yes.
As close as that?
As close as that. I think about 6, 7 meters.
And what happened? What is said to him?
What the soldiers said happened was that John came in here and made towards the gravestone. And their orders was to arrest whoever would come.
The two SAS men were tried for murder. They said they believed their lives were in danger when John picked up a rifle from the cache and turned towards them. The judge acquitted them, but said that one SAS soldier was an untrustworthy witness. Did you have any apology from the SAS or apology from the army?
No, none at all, never a word.
Nobody said sorry?
No.
Even though you told the police about it, nobody said?
No, nobody ever said to me I'd done a good job, that I'd done the right thing.
The tragic death in the village graveyard convinced nationalists that the Brits were operating a shoot-to-kill policy, with the SAS pulling the trigger. What was your view of the SAS?
Well, it would have been easy to have arrested John. It should have been easy to have arrested John. They didn't do it. And I didn't think much about them at the time, but as time went on and you watched what was happening around, the SAS didn't arrest very many.
In Dunloy, the killing of John Boyle hardened support for the IRA. On a later occasion, there was intelligence that the IRA was about to mount an operation. The Det had bugged one of the IRA's weapons and placed a house under surveillance. Frank and his partner Paul had moved in to watch from a building site opposite the newly built house.
We were wearing just civilian clothes, so that if we were seen, people would think we were nicking lead or bricks or whatever. Acting the part of just yobbos, basically. We could see the house and we could see what was going on. We were expecting certain cars to come and go to the house, and we wanted to see which cars were associated with the house and various people.
But what the Det did not know was that the IRA suspected they were under surveillance and had sent out 2 of its members to scout the area.
Out of the blue, or out of the black, then came this shout of, what the hell are you doing, effing and blinding. They were obviously very agitated. But all they did was make us stand up with our hands in the air, like cowboys, standing with our hands in the air and still screaming and shouting at us. We just looked into each other's eyes and nodded, and at a time which was obviously right, we drew our concealed pistols. You aim for the centre of the observed mass, which in this case is, the torso of a man, because he's trying to do the same to you. And you fire as many rounds as you can and get him down, which is what we did. But the guy with the submachine gun, he was hit, and as he went down, he fired, I think it was 13 rounds. I used to think it was unlucky 13. 3 of the rounds hit me, 1 through my knee, 1 through my thigh, and 1 through my back. The other 4 or 5 rounds that he fired hit Paul high in the chest, and I think he was probably killed immediately.
But the 2 IRA men were still alive.
And then I could hear the 2, Hogan and Martin. They went dead. They weren't exactly talking, but they were making a noise. So I think I'd still got some rounds left in my Browning, so I fired a couple more rounds into them.
Frank radioed the Det backup team that was only a few minutes away.
And then the car team arrived. The guys arrived, and they came forward. I indicated to them 2 terrorists to the front. They could have still been capable of putting rounds down.
So they finished them off?
So the guys came in and put rounds into them.
Finished them off?
It's, you win the firefight, and that's it.
But they're wounded, they could have been arrested, couldn't they?
Yeah, but you don't know that, do you? Far better for them to be dead than us.
Martin's parents didn't know he'd joined the IRA. Hogan was from a staunch Republican family. At the funeral, Gerry Adams said they were freedom fighters murdered by a British terror gang. Controversy dogged the regular army too, in particular the part-time soldiers of the Ulster Defence Regiment, the UDR. The vast majority were Protestants. As violence increased, some decided to disregard the constraints of the law. Several were convicted of murder and other serious crimes. They'd been hand in glove with the loyalist paramilitaries. Republicans cried collusion, claiming it was sanctioned by the state.
There were quite a number who, no doubt, did pass information and indeed some weapons on to the loyalist paramilitaries.
Some were also members of the loyalist.
Some were also members of the loyalist paramilitaries.
At the same time as they were members of the British Army, the UDR.
Yeah.
And that caused you concern?
Yes. Caused everybody concern. It caused the army concern. I mean, well, it wasn't us at Stormont Castle. I mean, it was concern to everybody.
And there were elements in the RUC too who had dual membership. There were policemen who were also members of the UEF.
There were a lot of funny people all over the place. There's no doubt about that at all. Some were known and some were not known. And some were weeded out and some were not weeded out.
Most policemen and UDR soldiers who took the law into their own hands lived in country areas where they were seen as soft targets by the IRA. William McCaughey joined the RUC to defend Ulster, but in frustration he sought to hit back.
It was a combination of a feeling that the state was not responding adequately and, I suppose, a perfectly human desire for revenge against those or against that community which had killed my friends.
McCaughey was also a member of the loyalist paramilitary group, the UVF. In this guise, he took his revenge. The target was a Catholic who ran a corner shop in the village of Ahohill. The assassins knocked at his door in the middle of the night and gunned him down. The RUC said the victim was a law-abiding citizen. McCaughey thought otherwise. When you were going to kill
the individual concerned. Didn't it occur to you that you were a policeman? Didn't you say to yourself, what am I doing here, a member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary going out to kill somebody?
No, to be perfectly honest, the fact that I was a member of the RUC didn't enter my mind at all. I went there as an Ulster Loyalist in defence of the state of Northern Ireland. That was my only consideration and motivation.
McCaughey was a member of a 30-strong special police unit based in Armagh. He wasn't the only one involved in terrorist activity.
How many members of the unit were arrested? How many of the 30, roughly?
I think there was 10 arrested and 6 charged.
And how many found guilty?
6.
Of serious crime?
Yeah.
From murder to bombing to kidnapping?
Yes.
Didn't the conviction of Sergeant William McCaughey and half a dozen of his police colleagues indicate that there was collusion between the police and the loyalist paramilitaries in the late 70s?
Well, you see, again, in terms of allegations of collusion, the allegation is that this is systemic, that this is organisational.
But in the case of Sergeant McCaughey, he was a policeman, he was a member of the UVF, he was convicted of murder.
I think you have to look at how the activities of such people are investigated. Is there any tolerance of that, or is there absolute rigorous intolerance? And I think the latter applies so far as the RUC is concerned. Wherever it has had such people, it has acted rigorously to root them out and bring them to justice.
McCaughey served a life sentence for murder inside the Maze prison. Here, like all Loyalist and Republican inmates, he was treated as a common criminal. Government policy had changed. Since the early 70s, all prisoners had enjoyed a special status, which, to their minds, recognised they were prisoners of war. But before McCaughey was sentenced, the status was abolished, and the government insisted that all prisoners were criminals. During his time in jail, McCaughey found the Lord and repented of what he had done. But he still maintained that he'd been defending Ulster and therefore wasn't a criminal.
These were criminal activities, not merely by the IRA, but also increasingly by the Loyalists. And they should have been dealt with under the criminal law. It's the whole basis of a democracy. You can't have any other basis other than locking people up by due legal process.
But the IRA argued that they weren't criminals, that they were fighting a political war to get the British out of Northern Ireland. They resented being called criminals.
Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with that, and I never have agreed with that.
The government refused to give in. To do so would have left its new policy in ruins. IRA prisoners then escalated their protest with the weapon of last resort, the hunger strike. 7 IRA prisoners refused food for weeks on end. Whitehall officials faced a dreadful dilemma.
First of all, force feeding was out. Therefore, if the hunger strike continued, these people would die. Therefore, we would have more martyrs. And Northern Ireland is not a place to grow martyrs if you can avoid it. Therefore, we were very anxious to try to find some way of enabling the hunger strikers to get off their hook.
If a compromise were to be found, it would have to be devised in the utmost secrecy. In public, the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, was adamant that there would be no concessions. In private, things were once again moving behind the scenes. The mover was the MI6 officer Michael Oatley, who'd helped negotiate the IRA ceasefire 5 years earlier. He re-emerged from the shadows as several of the prisoners neared death. His link to the IRA was via a friend in Derry. The IRA wanted the issue resolved.
I was rung up by a friend who said, "This is the situation, I think we can do something with it." As usual, the telephone call came at 1 or 2 in the morning. We spent 2 or 3 hours discussing the situation in veiled language over the telephone. I produced a set of proposals as to how the matter might be managed with a formula, and went the following morning with it to the Northern Ireland office.
I got the authority of ministers to proceed with this course of action. Went downstairs, put Michael Oakley in my car. He was driven at speed to London Airport, put on the shuttle to Belfast, and met at the other end, all within the space of a very few hours. And it was accomplished.
Did you clear it with the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher?
Yes.
And what did she say?
She approved.
Death was now close. The leader, Brendan Hughes, seen here, had gone without food for over 50 days.
The priest was asked to go to Belfast International Airport, I believe, and there he would meet a person with a red carnation. I laughed the night the priest told me this, sitting in the prison, and the priest duly went to the airport, and lo and behold, this guy with a red carnation passed by and passed the document over to Father Brendan.
Oakley had brought revised prison rules, which, to the IRA, were capable of liberal interpretation.
I sincerely believed, but it was a status that we could work with, and we could end this thing. I believed that then, yeah.
Remarkably, Oakley seemed to have ended the hunger strike without loss of face. The prisoners' clothes arrived at the maze, but would they be allowed to put them on? The climax of the epic confrontation was still to come. One of the prisoners' most vociferous champions was Bernadette McCallasky, still known to many as Bernadette Devlin. What happened to her raised even more questions about the SAS.
And if Britain lets one man or woman die in those prisons, she may well fan the same spark that burns today, and has burned ever since in this country, into one more flame of resistance that will free 32 counties and build a country we can all live in.
At this critical time, Bernadette McCallasky was top of the Loyalists' hate list.
What did she represent to you as a person?
Detestable bits.
What did you set out to do?
To take her out, to kill her.
This Loyalist was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder. He asked us to conceal his identity. Bernadette McCallasky lived with her husband Michael and their children in a remote bungalow outside Dungannon. The Loyalist hit squad planned to bring down the telephone line that was their only contact with the outside world. The attack came at breakfast time.
We drove for about 45 minutes to a place where she lived. It was a very bad morning. Snow, sleet, rain, very dark. Got to the house, two of us went into the house, and the driver stayed outside. His job was to pull the telephone wires down. We went in to the house. That's what we had to do in the house.
How did you get into the house?
We had a sledge, but it wasn't used. The door was kicked in.
Did you shoot?
I did, yeah.
How many shots?
5.
At whom?
At both.
Did you hit them?
Yeah.
Did you think you killed them?
Yeah, I did.
What the Loyalist UFF did not know was that there was intelligence on the attack, and the SAS had been deployed to the scene.
When we come out, the first thing I heard was shouts. British security forces, drop your arms.
With the shooting and the arrest over, the Army's quick reaction force was helicoptered in to deal with the fallout. One of its members now reveals what the SAS told him when he first arrived on the ground.
He said, "Bernadette Devlin's been shot." To which I replied, "Yes, and I'm the Pope in Rome." Obviously, not that I didn't believe it. It was just something that, you know, to get that name branded at you, having just got out of an helicopter. And it turned out that she had. So we went as quick as we could round to the house. I think we went in through the kitchen door. And lo and behold, her and her husband, Michael Makaliski, had also been shot. So we give first aid as much as we could.
The question that immediately sprang to mind was why the SAS hadn't shot or arrested the Loyalists before the deed was done. Why didn't the soldiers stop you? Why didn't they apprehend you before you kicked the door down?
I couldn't answer that.
Because if they had seen you going in, they would have seen you presumably carrying weapons? You'd have expected
if they saw us, they must have saw the weapons.
You would have expected them to have intervened and stopped you?
I suppose so, but you would need to ask them.
So why had the Loyalist killers been allowed to bring down the telephone line and smash in the door without being stopped? It was what the corporal asked the SAS.
I said, well, how come you didn't get them on the way in? Of which there was a pause, and he said, we must have been looking the other way. Which did for me. It was a throwaway line as far as I was concerned, and I just went about my business.
The McAlleskers were given first aid by the corporal and then flown to Belfast for emergency surgery. Miraculously, they both survived, but the mystery of why the SAS hadn't intercepted the Loyalists remained unresolved.
Obviously, it was the talk of the town. The more we talked about it, the more we thought, surely they would have got them on the way in. Remains unanswered, as far as I was concerned.
What do you think happened?
Personally, my personal view is that they allowed them in to do the deed and then stop them on the way out.
Meanwhile, the continuing drama inside the maze was about to reach its climax. The prisoners were never given their own clothes and felt duped by the Brits. A second hunger strike began, now led by their commanding officer, Bobby Sands. Sands died after 66 days on hunger strike. 100,000 mourners followed his coffin. What made his death even more significant was that he'd just been elected a Westminster MP. Others were to follow in his wake. This time there'd been no Michael Oatley to intervene. By now he was out of the country. Attitudes on both sides had hardened, and Mrs. Thatcher refused to give in. 9 more Republican prisoners were to follow Sands to his grave. With the first hunger strike resolved, the second should never have happened. Did you think that 10 men would die?
That was what we were fearful of when we dealt with the first hunger strike. Yes, we did believe that they had the resolution to go through with this and that men would die. That was why we tried to avert it and did so on the first hunger strike. But having averted it once, I can well see that there was very, very little that anybody could do to avert it the second time. There was no room for compromise then. None was sought.
Wouldn't it have been worth just giving them their own clothes? To save 10 lives, to save the political gains that Sinn Féin got from the hunger strike, all that?
Oh, probably, yes. Yes. But once these situations arise in which the stakes are raised on both sides, it becomes very difficult.
The IRA had raised the stakes on the military front too, even before the hunger strike. They'd ambushed an army convoy at Warrenpoint with 2 huge remote-control bombs. The first was hidden in a hay lorry. A paratrooper saw it explode.
I'm actually watching as it happens, and then the hay lorry and the second truck just disappeared together. A big explosion. The truck went up about 100 feet in the air and came down on the central reservation.
18 soldiers were killed.
It was arguably, I think, the most successful and certainly one of the best planned IRA attacks of the whole campaign. We'd always said that one of these days there will be a spectacular. It was almost inevitable that at some stage or other they were going to succeed because we'd failed to interdict them.
The IRA had dealt the British a double blow that day. In the Irish Republic, a few hours before, it had killed Lord Mountbatten with another remote-control bomb. The Prime Minister wanted to know what had gone wrong. Why was there no intelligence? Who was to blame? An inquest was held, and the government appointed a former head of MI6 to sort out the intelligence mess. It could not be allowed to happen again.
The intelligence gathering of the RUC and of the army was not, I suspect, effectively shared. That is my suspicion, but I think it's probably a well-founded suspicion that it was not effectively shared.
In what sense?
They weren't talking to each other when they should have been talking to each other.
But that's astonishing, isn't it? That here you have two organisations united in what one assumes to be the defeat of terrorism, and yet they're not talking to each other.
Well, that was the problem.
By the early 80s, the rivalries appeared to have been sorted out. With the police now in control, operations were directed from this office, the Tasking and Coordinating Group, or TCG. It's never been filmed before. From here, all the intelligence agencies, Army, Police and MI5, monitor operations on the ground and act accordingly.
I think they were tremendously effective. These were organisations into which all intelligence should flow, whether that be from human agents, or whether it be intelligence technically gained, or whether it be information gleaned simply from members of the public phoning in, or from officers who are out and about their normal duties.
Among the TCG's resources are two offensive arms. One is the SAS, the other the HMSU, the Headquarters Mobile Support Unit, the RUC's anti-terrorist squad trained by the SAS. Like the SAS, this special police unit became the focus of intense controversy. At the end of 1982, the police unit shot dead 3 IRA men and 2 members of the INLA. None of them was armed. Republicans accuse the RUC of operating a shoot-to-kill policy. The fact that police officers were tried for murder and acquitted simply convinced Republicans that there was a cover-up.
It is they that Parr has now given the licence to kill through the newly formed shoot-to-kill assassination squad of the RUC.
The officer appointed to investigate these sensitive killings was John Stalker, the Deputy Chief Constable of Greater Manchester. There was widespread outrage when it was revealed that officers from the Special Police Unit had not told the truth. What made the Stalker cases even more controversial was the evidence that the police tried to cover up what they had done. They told cover stories, they told lies, and that simply confirmed people's suspicions that there was a shoot-to-kill policy and the whole thing was operating illegally.
I think that did give rise to those perceptions, undoubtedly. That's the case. I think the motivation for those cover stories was the protection of methodology, the protection of informants who had originally given intelligence, and I think the intention was to create a perception that these police officers just happened to be in the places they were.
Which they weren't.
Which they weren't. They were there on a planned basis. They were there on the basis of intelligence.
Stalker penetrated the darkest corners of the secret war when he investigated the dramatic events that took place at this hayshed. Special Branch had established that the IRA had hidden a huge quantity of explosives inside, and MI5 had planted a listening device to keep track of them. But the device failed to work. The explosives vanished. The result, a huge crater a few miles away, 15 feet deep and 40 feet wide. The explosives had been used to ambush a police car. The 3 officers inside were killed. Had MI5's bug been working, the tragedy wouldn't have happened. MI5 then planted a second device in case the IRA returned. When the device picked up voices, the Special Police Unit moved in and shot dead 17-year-old Michael Tighe. He'd no IRA connections. His friend Martin Macaulay was wounded. Inside were 3 old rifles without ammunition. The police said they'd shouted a warning. Macaulay told a different story.
I looked at the barn, the window was open. Went over to the window, there was metal objects. McLean didn't have a look. Within a few minutes, Michael Tighe, there was 2 shots rang out, Michael Tighe was killed instantly. I seen a guy with a rifle moving across the door. Once he had disappeared, the whole place exploded in gunfire. I moved to get cover to the opposite side of the door, and in doing that I was hit.
But it should have been possible to find out whether a warning had been given. MI5's second device had been working at the time of the shooting, and the tape of it ought to have resolved the contradiction. Stalker discovered that MI5 had made 42 tapes of the hayshed. He concluded that the last tape, tape 42, must have recorded the shooting and therefore could resolve the question once and for all. For months he fought to obtain the master tape and was constantly thwarted. He was eventually told it no longer existed.
It transpires that the vital tape, the security service tape that recorded the actual shooting at the hayshed, disappears and is destroyed.
Well, I mean, I have no personal knowledge of that, but clearly...
Well, you know the tape disappeared.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I mean, that was very much the focus of John Stalker's investigation. And of course these things, of course they give rise to the gravest suspicions in the minds of people as to what lay behind those sorts of things.
Although the master tape, tape 42, had been destroyed, what John Stalker did not know was that a cassette copy of it had been secretly made by one of those monitoring the hayshed at the time as a macabre personal souvenir. When MI5 found out, it ordered the cassette copy to be handed over to it, and it remained locked away in MI5 safekeeping for some years, until, that is, John Stalker appeared on the scene. Around that time, a senior MI5 officer in the province ordered one of his MI5 colleagues to destroy the priceless cassette copy. As a result, the vital remaining evidence as to whether police officers did issue a warning before opening fire was removed. Did you know that a copy of that tape had been made?
No.
And did you find out that a copy wanted to be made had been destroyed by the security service?
Only when I heard about it from the report. I didn't know about these things in advance.
Colin Sampson, the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, completed Stalker's inquiry. We have discovered that, controversially, his report recommended that MI5 officers should be prosecuted for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The great majority of those who heard the tape heard no warning. And when you read in Mr. Sampson's report that the copy of the tape had been destroyed by the security service, what was your reaction?
That this, if true, was most unfortunate.
The Attorney General of the day was Sir Patrick Mayhew. Although he was told that there was sufficient evidence for prosecutions, a political decision was made that they would not be in the public interest.
The last thing the government wanted to see was MI5 officers in the dock, charged with destroying vital evidence. It would have been political dynamite, and the consequences for MI5 would have been seismic.
What I had in mind was that criminal proceedings would be used under the procedures of the court to elicit a lot of material of vital importance to the intelligence services, and that this would be enormously damaging.
It would also have been extremely embarrassing if security service officers had been in court charged with destroying the vital evidence that John Stalker had been looking for.
Yes, indeed.
The copy of the tape.
Yes, yes.
The additional reason why prosecutions would have been so sensitive is that some of those against whom prosecutions would have been brought were serving members of the security service MI5. That was the additional sensitivity, wasn't it?
Well, I think I've said what I said to the House of Commons, which represented the truth, that a lot of intelligence matters would have been brought out, and that would have been very deleterious to the intelligence operation that was essential in the circumstances of the time.
Were you in favour of prosecuting?
I think I saw it as a finely balanced case. I don't think I don't want to go further than that.
The problem, of course, was by declaring that there would be no prosecutions in the public interest, people simply said, well, what did we tell you all along? It was a cover-up.
Yeah.
If the political bombshell ticking away in the hayshed had exploded in court, it might have jeopardised not only MI5's methodology, but MI5 itself. Covert operations were thereby preserved. All soldiers and policemen are legally bound by the yellow card, which allows them to open fire only when their lives are threatened. But there are no unbiased witnesses to an armed confrontation. In the heat of battle, legal niceties may not always be observed.
There is not a shoot-to-kill policy.
Anna joined the Det in the 1980s and took part in many covert operations against the IRA.
All I can say is that on every briefing it was the yellow card and that arrest, and obviously if arms are brought to bear that you would open fire if you believed your life or somebody else's life was in danger.
Wasn't there a nod and a wink on the yellow card?
None at all. Nothing like that at all. They're professionals. They're professional soldiers, not cowboys.
But however precise the orders to arrest, no Republican will ever believe that there was not a shoot-to-kill policy. They simply point to their graves. The Brits shed few tears for their victims, knowing that few would be shed for them.
Explore a different world next on UK TV History. How would the fate of Britain be altered if the Romans hadn't triumphed against Boudicca's army?